The conflict in Ukraine, or rather, perhaps I should say, Ukraine's offensive in the conflict as of today, 3rd of August, appears to continue to be stuck. There's been more sporadic attacks in the Rabotina area south of Orechov, but certainly nothing that remotely approaches a breakthrough. Again, we've had what are now relatively small groups of Ukrainian troops in penny packet groups advancing towards the Russian lines, where many of them die in artillery and machine gun strikes or walk over mines. In any event, they failed to make any progress in that area whatsoever. And the same seems to be true further west in the other part of the southern front lines near Piatichatki, where again there have been sporadic attacks, but with the same outcome as always up to now, a failure by Ukraine to make any significant advances, or indeed any advances at all. Now, there are reports that there has been a build-up of Ukrainian forces, again on the Vremevka ledge near Staromayorsk, and that the Ukrainians might be attempting another attack in that particular sector, but if so, that hasn't happened up to this point. Now, the Russian news agency TASS does provide us with this particular report, and it's from an interview taken with Yan Gagin, who is an advisor of Denis Pushilin, the acting head of the Donetsk regional government. He's been appointed that position by the Russians. He's, of course, a Russian-appointed official. So it's important to say that Gagin is a Russian official. But anyway, he says that they, meaning the Ukrainians, have amassed significant forces near Staromayorsk and keep trying to retake the settlement, hitting our mines and coming under artillery strikes. The settlement has become a kind of trap for them, where we are reducing their numbers. And according to Gagin, the Ukrainian army is suffering huge troop losses in battles near Staromayorsk. Now, the way Gagin describes it, one would get the impression that the Russians have actually recaptured Staromayorsk and that the Ukrainians are trying to retake Staromayorsk from the Russians. My understanding of the position is different. My understanding is that neither side actually controls this village, that it is in effect in the grey zone, that it is very much like Piatichatki. When they pulled out, the Russians made sure that all the buildings in the village had been completely leveled, and of course many of them had already been destroyed in the heavy artillery fire that preceded the battle that took place in this village last week. The result is that there is no cover for Ukrainian troops. When they enter the ruins of the village, they are immediately exposed to Russian artillery strikes. The Russians control the hills around this village so that they can monitor anything that takes place inside it. And as Gagin says, the village has become a kind of trap for the Ukrainian soldiers. And that, of course, is identical to what has happened at the other end of the southern battle lines, in the western part of the battle lines, near Piatichatki, in the village of Piatichatki. Again, this village has been essentially leveled. It's become effectively a ruin. Neither side controls it. Neither side is able to occupy the ruins for any space of time. But whenever the Ukrainians do try to advance through it, they immediately become targets for the Russian artillery in the heights nearby. And as a number of commentators have pointed out, this is clearly, in both cases, a trap pre-prepared by the Russian military. They've worked out all the sight lines, they've got all the measurements and things that they need to have in order to be able to launch devastating artillery strikes on Ukrainian troops who enter this village. And given that this village lies on this one road, this twisting road, as it's been described, that passes through the Remevka ledge, and which, in theory, leads on to Mariupol. Given that it's impossible to bypass this road, apparently all the fields on either side of this road have been heavily mined by the Russians. The Ukrainians are in effect bottled up. At the moment, or at least for the moment, they can't break through. No doubt they will make an effort at some point, but the fighting in Staromayorsk is beginning to look like it's becoming positional. And that is also true of the fighting in the Bakhmut area, the former Bakhmut, the place that's now called by the Russians Artyomsk, reverting to the Soviet era name for this town. I read an account of Artyomsk, a description of it by a Russian tour operator who guides people around Moscow. He's recently been to Artyomsk to see what it looks like, and he described a deserted, devastated town. Again, it's empty of inhabitants. There's soldiers there and military people, but it's still subjected to sporadic but at times intense artillery fire from the Ukrainian side, and it's most dangerous for people to live there, to stay there, and in the meantime the Russians seem to be holding their positions on either flank of it and in the town itself. And again, the fighting here has become what the Russians call positional. In other words, there's artillery exchanges, there's sporadic raids by each side upon the other. There's occasional attempts to capture minor positions, but there's no real attempt, for the moment at least, to carry out any significant offensive operation. So this seems to be the situation as of today, as of the time of making of this program, on all three axes of Ukraine's advance: positional fighting, an offensive that is essentially at a standstill. And there's been a rather curious justification, explanation for this today from the British Ministry of Defence in its latest bulletin discussing the state of the war. And it says that one of the reasons why the Ukrainian offensive, is not proceeding as planned is because Ukraine has experienced problems overcoming the local vegetation. Apparently, because this land, some of it agricultural land, is not being tilled or maintained by the farmers, who of course are unable to work on it because of the ongoing war. It's become covered in weeds, and the forest plantations have become denser, and this has allowed the Russians to camouflage themselves, to take advantage of the foliage and the vegetation, and to conceal themselves from the advancing Ukrainians. Well, I'm absolutely sure that this is true, but I would have thought that this is the kind of problem which an army planning an offensive would take into account. It seems a little strange, to me at least, that the British Defence Ministry and perhaps the Ukrainians didn't anticipate this rather obvious problem. I have to say that the British Defence Ministry has published some very strange bulletins, updates about the fighting over the course of this war. I found this one to be quite perhaps the strangest. Anyway, there we are. It's the plants that are apparently winning the war for Russia. But, you know, what else is going on? Well, there has been fighting in other places, and there were reports today that the Russians have launched some further advance, undertaking some further advance towards Vuhledar in the south of Donetsk region. Apparently this is, well, it's been described as more than a reconnaissance in force. It's a serious attempt to move towards Vuhledar, and it seems that it's backed by air-to-ground support from the Russian Air Force. So perhaps something is going to happen in Vuhledar. This has been a difficult battle for the Russians. They did make, it seems, a serious attempt to capture Vuhledar in the winter, which miscarried. Some people think or say that it was errors made by the general in charge, General Muradov, who was later relieved. Who's to say? I'm not able to comment on any of that. But anyway, this has been a long, difficult battle for the Russians, capturing this particular heavily fortified town. Quite small, by the way. But perhaps this will evolve into something more serious and a real attempt to capture Vuhledar. Again, we shall have to see. And further north still, there continues to be a cascade of very impressionistic and, I have to say, rather sketchy reports talking about further Russian advances in the north, in the Liman, Kras, Svatovo, Kremenaya and Kupiansk areas. Every day I read about settlements and positions that the Russians are supposed to be capturing in this area. As the details are not always clear and the reports are not always consistent with each other, but it does seem as if the Russians are still gradually advancing in this area as well. So that is the overall situation on the battlefronts. Ukraine continues to conduct its offensive, but for the moment at least, it does seem to be ebbing. Now, I have read some claims that the offensive has effectively run its course, that it is in effect already over, that Ukraine has had to use both of the army corps, the 9th and the 10th Army Corps, that had been assigned for this offensive. The 9th Army Corps was the corps that was committed to the fighting in the first week of June, and which was supposed to break through the Russian fortified lines, and the 10th Army Corps was supposed to provide the follow-up, which would exploit that breakthrough and press on towards the Sea of Azov. Over the course of the June fighting, the 9th Corps basically spent itself, and it seems that over the course of July, the assault, the attacks on the Russian lines was assumed by the troops of the 10th Corps. So instead of exploiting the breakthrough, the troops of the 10th Corps were given the task of achieving that breakthrough, which their comrades in the 9th Corps had failed to achieve. Anyway, as we know, in the second week half of July, the 10th Corps did go into action. It suffered devastating losses, and it didn't break through. And for the moment at least, it does seem as if the situation has come to essentially a stop. However, I would express a word of caution about rushing to the conclusion that the offensive is over. I think that the political investment in this offensive by now is so enormous that I don't think the Ukrainians at this point, in the first week of August, are really in a position to call it off. They still have some troops in reserve, and though perhaps the right thing to do, the proper thing to do, would be to follow the advice of Beebe and Webb in that article I read from Time magazine a couple of days ago, in which they said that what Ukraine needed to do was to stop the offensive and go onto the defense, even if that meant ceding some ground to the Russians, trying to hold the Russians off and using the time both to consolidate and to prepare the grounds for negotiations. Well, I think instead of Ukraine doing that, it is much more likely that at some point over the next few weeks, it will commit its remaining reserves into launching a further offensive in possibly a different direction. And in fact, this morning, I read on various Telegram channels that there are rumors circulating that there's been another difficult telephone conversation between one of Zelensky's advisors, Mr. Yermak, and a US official, presumably Jake Sullivan, and that Yermak came under a great deal of pressure from the American side to get the offensive moving again. And it was agreed that this was what would happen, and that the plan this time is for an amphibious assault over the Dnieper River, presumably into eastern Kherson region. And Yermak, apparently on behalf of Ukraine, committed Ukraine to that operation, though the reports say that the timetable for this offensive, this attack, has not yet been agreed or decided. So it may be that this is what will come. I'm guessing that if that is the plan, then it will take some weeks to assemble the troops and to prepare the plans and to organize what will no doubt be a very complex operation to cross the Dnieper. And it'll be interesting to see, by the way, where this happens, whether it will happen in the area south of the now destroyed Novaya Kakhovka Dam. I understand that the water levels in this part of the Dnieper have now essentially returned to their normal levels, or whether it will be attempted across the reservoir north of the Novaya Kakhovka Dam. This is now largely drained. I understand that the ground is still extremely soft, but perhaps the hope is that at some point it will become crossable, and perhaps the plan is to try to launch an offensive, maybe with these new Western tanks, the Abrams and the Leopard ones, across this reservoir, perhaps when the winter frosts make the ground harder. So I wouldn't rush to conclusions that the offensive has completely ended. On the contrary, it may be that we're in for a long pause, but I would reiterate again that we had all those rather concerning reports about Ukraine resuming the offensive after the autumn rains and the Rasputitsa, the autumn mud, and that it could be that the best and most logical time to do that, especially some kind of crossing of the reservoir, is what is being planned. It could be that this is going to be postponed until the early winter, the November frosts, when the ground is harder and tanks and armoured vehicles can move over softer ground, or what had been up to then softer ground, with the hope that the ground in the reservoir will have become hard enough to bear the weight of these vehicles and these tanks. I doubt that, by the way, but who's to say? In any event, even if the attempt is made to cross the Dnieper further south of the Novaya Kakhovka Dam and to do it by boat rather, and if this attempt is done, say this summer, which it might still be, we don't have a date for it, well, I think that will also be a very complicated and very difficult operation. And I should say that for the moment, the Russians have put themselves in a position where behind their fortified lines on the east bank, their artillery seems perfectly capable and has been systematically destroying Ukrainian fast boats which are attempting to cross the Dnieper River and to position to capture a bridgehead there. Up to now, all of these attempts to establish a bridgehead on the east bank of the Dnieper have proved a failure. But anyway, we will see. Now, on the topic of an assault across the Dnieper, I would say that I do recall that Putin said in one of the interviews he had that he was actually disclosing what he said was a secret, that this is what the Russian military actually wanted at that time the Ukrainians to do. They were confident that if Ukraine did try an assault against over the Dnieper, that the Russians would not only be able to contain it, but that they would be able to defeat and perhaps destroy whatever Ukrainian forces attempted to undertake that crossing. However, it must be said that my recollection also is that Putin made those comments before the Novaya Kakhovka Dam was destroyed. So it could be that the destruction of the dam and the change in the course of the river has altered those calculations, and that Ukraine is in with more of a chance than Putin was talking about when he made those comments some weeks ago. Anyway, we will have to wait and see. But for the moment, one can perhaps, to coin a phrase, say that in terms of Ukraine's offensive, all is quiet on the southern and eastern front lines, though there does appear to be continued Russian military activity in the north, but this seems to me to fall well short of the outright offensive that some people are expecting the Russians to launch once this offensive is finally done with. So that, it seems to me, is a fair summary of the military situation overall. Now, that's the military situation. What else is happening in the world? Well, one thing that I would say is that, to a perhaps unhelpful extent, the conflict in Ukraine remains the dominant event in world affairs. I say unhelpful because in so many respects, so many things are going on in the world which do deserve attention. And of course, we have the events in West Africa, in Niger. The French and the Italians are saying that they're not going to intervene for the moment, at least that's what they're saying, that they're evacuating their nationals, and that's the only thing that they are planning to do. That could be correct, but I have to say that my memories of the West's intervention in Libya in 2011 was that before the Western powers began an intervention in Libya, they made sure that they had evacuated their nationals first. And one of the paradoxes of that particular conflict was that the Gaddafi government, the authorities of the Gaddafi government, not only did nothing to obstruct the evacuation of Western citizens from Libya, but they actually facilitated it. So there was no question of the Libyan government, despite the very, very real danger of a Western attack, acting in any way to prevent Westerners leaving Libya and of trying to make them hostages. And obviously, that was the right thing for the Libyan authorities to do, but the fact that they acted in that appropriate way and that Colonel Gaddafi, Muammar Gaddafi, acted in that proper way, well, of course, they never got any credit for that in the West, or at least no recognition of that in the West. So when I see Westerners leaving Niger and evacuation being undertaken by Westerners of their nationals from Niger, I note the assurances that, an offensive, a Western intervention is not actually intended or planned, but I do remember what happened in Libya, and I will wait and see. Now, let me say a few things about the Niger situation. Firstly, in one of my recent videos, I greatly overestimated Niger's importance in the world uranium market. I read all kinds of commentaries about how important Niger was. It is important, but it doesn't dominate the world uranium market in the way that some people say. What has been happening in Niger, it seems, is that Niger has been supplying most of the nuclear material used by France in its civilian nuclear program, which of course provides 75% of France's electricity. But that is not to say that France cannot buy uranium in other places to keep its reactors running. It most certainly can. It's not to say either that if Niger somehow allies itself with Russia, which seems most unlikely to happen in my opinion, that even if Niger were to make its uranium completely inaccessible, well, there would still be uranium from other places which France could import and the European Union could import in order to keep their reactors going. But what does seem to be true is that the French were extracting or obtaining their uranium from Niger at what was, shall we say, an extremely competitive price, a very low price. And probably this was the single factor that might have irritated, angered people in Niger most. The country's poor, very poor, as some countries in Africa, of course, are. And there was resentment that its natural resources were being exploited by France in that particular way. And this may be one of the reasons why the coup does seem to enjoy a measure of popular support in Niger. So it's not quite as important to the global nuclear industry as I'd expected, but there may be problems for France. Anyway, there are risks. There doesn't seem to be an immediate intention to launch an intervention, but the evacuation of Western citizens from Niger is troubling and might be preparatory to something like that. And there are still apparently noises coming out of Nigeria which suggest that that country, the giant of West Africa, hasn't given up the idea of an intervention in Niger as well. Mali, Burkina Faso and Guinea have made it absolutely clear that they would strongly oppose an intervention by Western powers, or indeed Nigeria, into Niger. They've spoken about it being amounting, as far as they're concerned, to a declaration of war. Apparently Algeria, which has a powerful army in the region, has also made it clear that it too is strongly opposed to that kind of intervention in Niger. So we see a standoff developing. It could be that we're seeing new battle lines being drawn. I sincerely hope not. I would say that, again, that the correct thing for people to do is to stay calm and to let the situation in Niger, which seems overall to be quite stable, to sort itself out, at which point I'm confident that Niger, if it's left alone, will re-enter the uranium market in some form and market for other resources that it produces. Perhaps it will be able to negotiate higher prices, but certainly we're not looking at any kind of meltdown in the global economy or the global nuclear industry or anything like that. Meanwhile, however, tensions remain high. The new Niger government is concerned about them. They've taken steps apparently to close the American base that is located in Niger's territory, and this is a developing issue. But important though it is, with all the potential to create a major crisis in West Africa, if it's not handled well, a crisis which could potentially escalate into an armed conflict, with the risks that this will trigger immense humanitarian suffering and renewed migrant flows towards Europe. With all those concerns, the conflict in the situation in Niger, in West Africa, continues to be eclipsed by the conflict in Ukraine. And as I said, this is in some ways a shame. So much else is going on, so many other important things. But it is still a testament to the extent to which the US and its West and its European allies are still able to shape the international news agenda and indeed the international diplomatic situation, that to an unhealthy degree, the world continues to be focused on the situation in Ukraine, so that other problems are not being addressed and are probably accumulating and are getting worse. I wonder, by the way, how sustainable this will be. But anyway, in the meantime, all sorts of things are going on which continue to be related to Ukraine. The most striking is that the Jeddah conference, this conference in Saudi Arabia, organized by the US, but also hosted by the Saudis, who alongside the US have sent out the invitations, that this conference seems to be quietly unraveling. Mexico refused to attend, so has China, and now so has Brazil. So with China and Brazil not going, it's going to be very difficult, it seems to me, to give this conference any meaningful purpose. Now, I've already said what I think the point of this conference was. I think, and this is just to repeat again, an idea first suggested by my colleague Alex Christoforou in the program in which we discussed this conference. Anyway, the point was that this conference in Jeddah was set up in the expectation that at this point in time, there would be a Ukrainian breakthrough. The offensive would have succeeded, the Ukrainians would have broken through, they'd have reached Melitopol or Mariupol, they would be trundling towards the Sea of Azov, perhaps they would already be there, and the United States called this meeting together with the intention of moving forward from that Ukrainian military victory onto a diplomatic track, rallying various countries which had up to that point remained neutral in the conflict to support President Zelensky's position. His plan, or so-called plan, for settling the war, which is basically for a total pullout by the Russians from every millimeter of ground claimed by Ukraine as its own. And since that breakthrough has failed to take place, as I've discussed in my recent programs, the Jeddah conference is in effect stillborn. Its purpose has not materialized. There is no Ukrainian breakthrough. The Ukrainians are not winning the war. In fact, all the indications suggest that they're starting to lose the war. And the result is that there is no real space for the Americans to sell Zelensky's plan as the basis for a solution to the conflict. And unsurprisingly, therefore, the various countries that were being invited to participate are showing little interest in doing so. Mexico has pulled out. They said they see no point in a meeting of this kind if the Russians are not there. China, well, it's not said very much about the Jeddah conference, but essentially it's declined its invitation. And Brazil has now refused to go as well. They're saying that they don't see the purpose of this meeting if the Russians are not there. And interestingly, they've now revealed something about the various discussions that took place in the conference that preceded the Jeddah conference, the one that launched this particular diplomatic process, the conference that took place some weeks ago in Copenhagen. The Brazilians now saying outright that that meeting in Copenhagen between the Western powers and countries like Brazil, India, and the others was a failure. And the reason it was a failure was because the only solution to the problem, the conflict that was placed on the table, was Zelensky's peace plan. And the Brazilians said that they and other non-aligned countries were very dissatisfied with that and made it clear that this was not the proper approach to follow in order to bring this conflict to an end. So, anyway, Brazil is not going, China is not going, Mexico is not going. It'll be very, very interesting to see whether or not India decides to go. But I suspect that if it does, it will do that which it has consistently done throughout this conflict. It will maneuver and navigate with great skill. It will make clear that it's not going to compromise or sacrifice its relations with Russia, which remain extremely valuable and important to India. I should say that earlier today on the Duran, with Professor Glenn Deason, I did a fascinating interview with M.K. Bhadrakumar, one of the former Indian diplomat, one of the most insightful commentators on global affairs. His blog, if you like, his website, perhaps better described as Indian Punchline, is indispensable reading for anybody who wants to understand the international picture and also to understand, to look at this international picture from an Indian perspective, something which we have far too little of in the West. Anyway, over the course of that program, we discussed the Indian position. He explained the value, the depth of the relationship between India and Russia. It is inconceivable that either the Indians or the Russians would be prepared to end that relationship. It is too important and too highly valued by both countries. Both countries have a strong emotional commitment to it. I have myself witnessed the Russian side of that commitment, and Mr. Badrakumar spoke eloquently about the similar strong feelings that exist about it in India as well. So the Indians, if they come to Jeddah, they will listen to everything that's said. They will hint at wise and perhaps proper solutions, but they will be very, very careful, as they have always been, not to commit themselves to anything that might compromise or damage their position or their interests in future. They have been doing this throughout this conflict, in my opinion, with great skill, and I expect that they will continue to do so. Of course, that is always assuming that they decide to go, and it may be, that they will decide in the end that they should not go at all. If India doesn't go, or indeed even if India does, it's quite clear to me that the Jeddah conference is hardly going to be a success. And I should say I've had a very helpful email from someone who's written to me from Saudi Arabia. And this correspondent, again, it's a private email, so I'm not going to disclose the identity of this person. But this person has said that it's been striking that the media in Saudi Arabia, commentary in Saudi Arabia about this conference is extremely low-key. The Saudis, perhaps sensing its likely failure, are giving little attention to it. So there we are. Now, I would say that the Saudis obviously have a strong reason for not compromising their relationship with the Russians. And here the dynamic is very different from India's because, of course, for much of the 20th century, the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Russia during the Soviet era was very, very poor. For much of that time, the two countries did not even have diplomatic relations, even though, as a matter of historical fact, the Soviet Union was one of the first countries to establish diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia in the 1920s, though very unwisely and foolishly, it severed those relations in the late 1930s and wasn't able to get them restarted again until the 1980s. But anyway, at the present time, the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Russia has become very much closer. The relationship between Saudi Arabia and China, of course, has become closer still. Putin and the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, well, their relationship is not always smooth. I remember that they had a furious row over oil prices and oil production at the start of 2020, for example. But anyway, despite that, they clearly respect each other a great deal and they clearly get on fairly well. But what underpins this Saudi-Russian relationship ultimately is not sentiment, it is oil. And the Russians have finally delivered on their promise made months ago to cut oil production by 500,000 barrels a day. And this has had an effect, together with the Saudi oil cuts, in starting to increase oil prices. The Saudis have announced that they're going to continue their oil production cuts into September, which is substantially greater than Russia's, by the way. And the Russians have just announced that they too will cut oil production in September, though the cut will be smaller. It will be around 300,000 barrels a day. So this is, for the Saudis, important. They don't want Russian oil flooding the oil market, as happened earlier this year, when the Russians were redirecting oil away from Europe and needed to secure markets in Asia, so they were prepared to sell oil at lower prices. That period is now past us. The Russians have stabilized their oil exports, and they're in a position to work with the Saudis on supporting the oil price, which is, of course, critically important for Saudi Arabia as well. And that does give the Russians some leverage over the Saudis. I'm not overstating this, but the Saudis will not, it seems to me, be looking for an argument with the Russians at this time. And I still tend to think that if the Jeddah conference takes place at all, the Saudis will be working to try to impress on the Ukrainians that their current position is unsustainable. And I noticed that Maria Zakharova, the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman, has made the same point. Anyway, that is the Jeddah summit. It looks, as I said, as if it is unraveling. And alongside that, however, on a completely different front, it looks as if there are now growing problems with the pending BRICS summit in South Africa. Now, it seems that India is unhappy about proposals to expand the BRICS. It feels that moves to bring in new members are premature. By the way, I think that on this, the Indians are right. I think that perhaps BRICS is capable of expanding to a certain degree. Maybe it could include countries like Saudi Arabia, for example. But certainly it is in no position at the moment to include 30 new members. I think that this is still an organisation that is finding its feet. Initially, it wasn't even an organisation. It was more a kind of club of leaders of certain countries who were seen as the big emerging market economies and who therefore came together to talk to each other about things. But when BRICS was first created, it was not anticipated that it would evolve into what is starting to look like a rival to the G7. So I think that the Indians are right to say, let's slow down on admitting new members. Let's consider carefully the development of the architecture of our organisation. But it seems also that India is concerned that this push to create an alternative payment system, which might eventually evolve into a reserve currency to rival the dollar, is also going forward too fast. And it seems that the Indians are worried that the structure of this payment system, if it is set up today, would be dominated by China, and relations between China and India have become more tense recently, and that is clearly becoming something of a problem. And there are some reports, and I'm not sure how correct these are, that Prime Minister Modi himself has decided that perhaps he's not going to attend the BRICS summit in South Africa in person. Like his friend Vladimir Putin of Russia, he prefers to remain in India and participate in the summit in a virtual format. Now, the summit will no doubt take place, but I'm going to suggest that if the summit is not going to proceed as smoothly and is not going to be quite as epoch-making as had been anticipated a few weeks ago, then a major reason for that is the absence of President Putin. I can understand why, given the difficult relationship between India and China at the present time, Modi, Prime Minister Modi, might be cautious about attending a multilateral meeting of this kind with countries like South Africa and Brazil, which are China's friends, without his own friend, who is also, of course, a friend of President Xi Jinping, President Putin of Russia, also there. And I can also understand why, in Putin's absence, Modi and the Indians might not be so keen at the moment to agree to substantial changes. It's important to say that I believe it's in September, India is also hosting the G20 meeting, and I have no doubt at all that Putin will be there, together with Xi Jinping, and of course with Lula da Silva, and also the South African leader, Cyril Ramaphosa. So there's a high likelihood that there will be a second informal BRICS meeting in Delhi when the G20 meeting takes place. And of course, the Western powers will also be there, but they will be kept at a distance, and it could be that some of the decisions, some of the more important decisions, are really going to be discussed by the leaders in Delhi rather than at the summit in South Africa. It is, in my opinion, just a delay in this process. I think these processes of BRICS development will continue, and to be entirely frank, I have been wondering that the speed of events was just a bit too fast given the complexity of some of the issues involved. Anyway, that's what I think about the BRICS summit. There are other things going on, and it now turns out that President Putin and President Erdogan of Turkey, they've had a long meeting, a long telephone call with each other, and it appears that the Russian-Turkish relationship, so complex and difficult for both sides, but so valuable to both sides, is now once again back on track. And the Russians have published a very lengthy and unusually informative readout of this telephone conversation between Erdogan and Putin. And we read telephone conversation with President of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Vladimir Putin had a telephone conversation with President of the Republic of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Now notice the readout doesn't tell us who initiated the call. So the Russians clearly are anxious to give an impression of equality. They're not making it look as if Erdogan is in any way the supplicant in this situation, though it is fairly well known that it is actually Erdogan who has been seeking this call. Anyway, this is what the body of the readout then goes on to say. The two leaders continued dialogue on various aspects of multifaceted Russian-Turkish cooperation. In particular, Vladimir Putin outlined Russia's position of principle in connection with the termination of the package agreements on the export of Ukrainian grain from the Black Sea ports and the unblocking of supplies of Russian food and fertilizers. He noted that in the context of a complete lack of progress in the implementation of the Russian part of the grain deal, its further extension was meaningless. He reaffirmed readiness to return to the Istanbul agreements as soon as the West fulfilled all the obligations set out in them. And I ought to say at this point that Erdogan, though expressing his deep regret at the ending of the grain deal, and also his desire to see it revived, has also made it very clear that he blames the Western powers ultimately for its failure, and has said that the best way to get it up and running again is for the Western powers to fulfill their part of the Istanbul agreements, with the implication, of course, that they have up to now not done so. I have to say that I think that both Putin and Erdogan know perfectly well that the Western powers will not agree to get the grain deal operating again by implementing the various parts of the grain deal which was supposed to facilitate exports of Russian fertilizer and food and agricultural products. Anyway, the readout then goes on to say, it was emphasized that taking into account the demand of countries most in need of food, Russia was working on reliable options for the supply of Russian grain, including on a free-of-charge basis. This issue was substantially discussed at the second Russia-Africa summit held recently in St. Petersburg. The attitude towards cooperation in this area with Turkey and other interested states was expressed. So here we see Putin, he says to Erdogan, not of course in these words, he says, look, I understand that you were doing very good business out of the grain deal. You were re-exporting grain, which we were supplying and which the Ukrainians were supplying. You were re-exporting grain to the European Union and to various other places, to China too. Well, we're not going to let Ukrainian grain be exported in that way. That business that you had is now gone. But don't worry, we're prepared to cut you in to our business. We're going to provide you with food and agricultural products and fertilizer to make up for what you were previously trading with Ukraine with. And maybe you'll make a little less, but you'll still make something. And perhaps, who knows, you might make even more. If that's cynical, just consider a cynical take. Just read these words again. The attitude towards cooperation in this area with Turkey and other interested states was expressed. Cooperation in this area with Turkey and other interested states. Well, I've often said that Erdogan, the one thing that he is extremely skilled at, the one thing that he always looks for, is the deal, the bargain. And here you see how he's managed to get a bargain from the Russians. He's made certain moves. A couple of weeks ago, they attracted a lot of attention, which undoubtedly ruffled Russian feathers. He seemed to be tilting more towards the west. Let the Azov commanders go to Ukraine. By the way, there's no reference to any of this in this readout, the Azov commanders business. He he says he supports now Sweden's application to join NATO. He said that he even supported Ukraine's application to join NATO. All sorts of things that the Russians wouldn't have wanted to hear. He's made it clear to the Russians that he's not happy with some of their recent moves, the cancellation of the grain deal, certain events that have been taking place in Syria, such things. And so he's tilted towards the Americans. He's got money out of the Americans, apparently an $11 billion loan from the IMF to help stabilize the Turkish economy. Some word that perhaps F-16s, modernized F-16s, might be heading Turkey's way. And now, of course, after seeming to tilt towards the west, rattling the Russians a little, he's managed to get something out of Putin. He's not going to have the Ukrainian business that he had anymore, or rather Turkey isn't, but he's going to get a share of the much bigger Russian business. And there it is. It's clearly set out in the readout. The Russians and the Turks, Putin and Erdogan, it might be a difficult, tricky relationship, but they understand each other perfectly. And I think outsiders, people who don't fully grasp what is going on, need to understand that and need to see through all the confusion and the statements and understand exactly what is going on. Anyway, we then read, when discussing the agenda of the Russian-Turkish partnership, the leaders focused on the prospects for the development of trade and economic ties, implementation of joint strategic projects in the energy sector, and cooperation in the tourism industry. Both sides expressed satisfaction with a steady growth of trade, which almost doubled by the end of 2022. So, let's read that again. Let's understand what that all means. Turkey will not implement sanctions. So the Russians can still use Turkey to get round the sanctions. So that's what the Russians get out of this. Turkey gets more Russian trade, more Russian investment, more Russian tourism. The economic ties are being strengthened. Trade doubled last year. We're not told from which base point. But just as Erdogan needs financial aid from the West in the form of that IMF loan, he also needs the trade with Russia to continue, and he's just got that commitment from the Russians that it will continue. But in return, he's giving clear promises, because none of this can happen. He's giving clear promises that Turkey will not jump onto the sanctions bandwagon, even whilst it remains a member of NATO. So again, we see the transactional nature of this relationship. And then we go on to read, Recep Tayyip Erdogan thanked the leadership and people of Russia for their assistance in extinguishing forest fires in Turkey. It was agreed to continue contacts at various levels, including in the context of preparations for a possible meeting between the two leaders. Now, note that the Russian readout has been careful to record Erdogan's words of thanks towards the Russian people and leadership. The word leadership is interesting, not President Putin personally, but the leadership, giving the impression that Russia is united, the Russian leadership is united in its commitment to this relationship with Turkey, and perhaps on Erdogan's side that he might even conceivably be looking for a future relationship with whoever replaces Putin as Russia's leader eventually. But anyway, might also, by the way, suggest still a certain froideur between the two leaders. Putin might still be a little annoyed with Erdogan over his moves of a few weeks ago. And anyway, Erdogan talked about his thanks to the leadership and people of Russia. But again, these are friendly words. They are intended to convey friendship. And then it was agreed to continue contacts at various levels, not just leader to leader levels, including in the context of context of preparations for a possible meeting between the two leaders. And it doesn't say here where that meeting will take place or the time frame of it, but it's clear that Erdogan wants it to happen in Turkey. He's repeated that it should happen in Turkey. He wants it to happen as soon as possible, preferably this month, and Putin is leaving that possibility open. So we see how transactional, but in some ways how stable this relationship is. There was a lot of commentary a few weeks ago that Turkey was drifting away from Russia, was coming closer to the West. We see that having got some of what they wanted from the West, $11 billion perhaps, plus, who knows, maybe even the F-16s. The Turks, having made clear to the Russians that they cannot be taken for granted, have managed to extract concessions from the Russians. They've extracted concessions on grain issues. They're going to be given a cut of the Russian trade in this booming market. They've also managed to get Russian commitments to increase trade, investment, and further fostering of economic ties and development of Turkey's tourist industry. But of course, the Russians in return are getting assurances that Turkey will not apply sanctions against Russia, or will not impose sanctions against Russia. And of course, it will continue to keep the Black Sea closed to NATO warships, US and British and French warships in particular. The two leaders, as I said, understand each other very well, even if the relationship between them is a very, very complex one. So that's further interesting development. There's a lot more going on. I've been asked to discuss the threat of hyperinflation in the Russian economy. This is the latest scare that the West is circulating about the state of the Russian economy. You may remember that a few months ago, it was the budget. The budget was going to collapse. There weren't enough oil receipts, supposedly. The deficit was going to spiral out of control. That has not happened. So we now move to the latest topic, which is hyperinflation, the risk of hyperinflation, inflation running out of control in Russia. Well, that will have to wait until my next video. The only thing I would say is that though economic conditions in Europe seem to be deteriorating, I've seen figures, PMI figures coming out of Switzerland, for example, and it looks as if orders for Swiss industry are basically collapsing, which suggests a bleak and darkening picture for the industrial situation in Europe. Even as all that is going on, there are signals that prices for commodities might start to rising again. We've seen the price of oil go up. We've seen the price of food very, very volatile and very important, even far more important than oil. Food prices appear to be rising as well. The Federal Reserve Board and the Bank of England have just both raised interest rates. They don't apparently think that the inflation crisis is over. But we're not supposed to worry about all of that going on in the West. We're supposed to focus on the threat of hyperinflation in Russia instead. But anyway, I will come to that probably in my next program. But in the meantime, all that remains is for me to wish you all a very good day, to remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. You can go to our shop and buy the amazing things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. So thank you again for joining me for this, again, longish video. Have a very good day, and more from me soon.